It was a warm Thursday evening when my world shifted. Tom and I had been married for 6 years. We'd been through a lot together, ups and downs, triumphs and challenges, but nothing had ever come close to threatening our bond. Or so I thought. That night, I had been in the kitchen preparing dinner while Tom sat in the living room chatting with his best friend, Jason. They were having a drink, talking about anything and everything. The door was slightly open, and as I moved between the kitchen and the hallway, I overheard parts of their conversation. At first, I wasn't paying close attention. It was just typical male banter, or so I thought. But then my ears caught something that made my stomach drop. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately," Tom said, his voice calm and almost reflective. "What, your fantasy?" Jason responded, his tone teasing. Tom chuckled. "Yeah. It's just something I've always wondered about. What would it be like to have someone else involved? You know, just to try it out." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. My heart began to race, and I stood frozen in place. The casual tone of the conversation made it sound like they were discussing the weather, but to me, it felt like an earthquake. He was talking about an idea that had never once come up in our relationship: introducing another person into our marriage. I could hear Jason laughing, almost encouraging him, but all I could focus on was Tom's words. I stayed hidden for a while, listening, my mind spinning. He didn't sound ashamed or embarrassed. It sounded like he was just casually sharing a thought with his friend. That thought, though, was a nightmare for me. Had he been harboring this desire for a long time? Was I not enough for him? We'd had a great marriage. At least I thought so. But this was something I could never have imagined. I quietly retreated to the kitchen, trying to steady my breath. I couldn't confront him right then. Not with my emotions so raw. Not when I was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of anger and hurt. Instead, I decided to hold it in, pretending everything was fine. But my mind raced in 1,000 directions. Had to know more. I had to understand what was going on in Tom's head. The next day, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. It was all I could think about: Tom's fantasy and what it might mean for us. I tried to go through my day as normal, but the thought of what I'd heard gnawed at me. How could I be with someone who was thinking about involving someone else? The days that followed were tense. I tried to act like everything was normal, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about the fantasy Tom had mentioned. The more I thought about it, the more I started questioning everything. My marriage, our intimacy, my worth. Was this something he truly wanted? Was I not satisfying him in some way? Had I missed something along the way? Tom did his best to reassure me, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something had shifted. He started being extra attentive, trying to compensate for what he knew was a painful issue. He would make dinner, bring me flowers, try to talk more about our feelings, but the fantasy still lingered in the background. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how my husband, the man I loved, had these desires that didn't include me. One night, as I lay in bed next to him, I watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. The love I had for him was still there, but so was a quiet resentment. Every time he touched me, it felt different. I didn't feel the same connection I once had. His hands, which used to send shivers down my spine, now felt foreign, like a reminder of everything I feared. I couldn't tell if it was my own insecurity or if something had actually changed, but I couldn't ignore the sense of loss. That evening after dinner, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront him. "Tom, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. He looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage I had. "I overheard you last night, talking to Jason, about your fantasy." His face immediately shifted from confusion to guilt, and I saw him swallow hard. "Oh God, you heard that?" I nodded, my eyes brimming with tears. "What does it mean, Tom? Why didn't you tell me?" He stood up, pacing for a moment, clearly struggling with what to say. "It's nothing. Just a fantasy. I never meant for you to find out. It's not something I ever intended to act on." I swear it's just a thought, something I've thought about occasionally, but it doesn't mean I want it. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but the damage was already done. The trust we had built over the years suddenly felt fragile. I felt a mix of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. Why would you even think about something like that? Why couldn't you tell me? I thought we were honest with each other. I didn't want to hurt you, he said softly, walking toward me. I never wanted to make you feel like you weren't enough. But I've had these thoughts, and I just didn't know how to bring them up. I should have been open with you, and I'm sorry. The apology seemed genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. I felt distant from him, as if I didn't really know him anymore. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, neither of us able to find the right words. A few weeks later, I found myself unable to continue in the same emotional turmoil. I needed answers. I needed to know if Tom still cared about me the way he had before, or if his thoughts had already shifted elsewhere. One evening when I couldn't hold it in anymore, I asked him again, "Do you still want this? Do you still want that fantasy?" This time, there was no hesitation in his answer. "No, I don't want that. I swear it was just a thought, one I didn't even think I'd act on. I want you and only you. But I've been afraid to tell you, and now I see how much it's hurt us." His words, though soothing, weren't enough to undo the damage that had already been done. I needed to feel safe again, and for that to happen we needed to communicate more openly, without fear of judgment or discomfort. We decided to seek help. Counseling to talk through our issues. The road to healing wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of deep frustration, of questioning whether we could ever truly move past the hurt. But in therapy we were able to open up more than we ever had before. We discussed our desires, our fears, and how we could be more transparent with one another. Slowly, the distance began to fade. Tom worked hard to prove his love for me, and I worked on rebuilding the trust that had been shaken. The fantasy that had once seemed like the end of us eventually became just a small part of our past, something that no longer defined us. We came out of the experience stronger, more connected. My husband's fantasy didn't break us. It was the fear, the secrecy, and the lack of communication that nearly tore us apart. But with time, effort, and a commitment to each other, we found our way back. Our marriage was far from perfect, but it was ours, and we learned to embrace each other's imperfections with love and understanding. And in the end, we realized that fantasies, like dreams, can exist without becoming reality. Our love, however, was something worth holding on to, something real, something worth fighting for.